Now we will have the second presentation of the afternoon with Isabella Lores Chavez, which is titled "The Plaster Cast and the Intimacy of the Studio." As we are seeing already, Isabella is a PhD candidate at the Columbia University. She is an author of Political Sites and Collective Identities in Hendrix Everkamp's Ice Skating Landscapes, and also a curator with the exhibition Dutch and French drawings from the Robert Lehman collection in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2013. So I welcome you, Isabella. Thank you so much for your virtual presence, as I am. So, and I ask you to begin whenever you're ready. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. I want to extend my gratitude and congratulations to the organizers of this exciting and truly exceptional Congress on a material that has become near and dear to me over the course of my doctoral work. Today, I want to share with you a selection of paintings made in the early modern Dutch Republic, in which I argue plaster casts invite us to consider the creative practices and ambitions that converged in the studio. The motif of the plaster cast in the studio enjoyed increasing popularity as painters proclaimed the nobility of their art. Painters use casts to develop essential drawing skills, to find inspiration for original compositions, and to demonstrate erudition. But these objects are not pictured as merely tools. In self-referential depictions of studios, plaster casts accrue meaning beyond the subjects they show, giving painters opportunities to imagine personal and aspirational ties to other masters. Plaster casts also augment the impression of looking in on the painter. They refer to the physical work that normally occurred behind closed doors. The particular penchant of Dutch artists for depicting these objects has been largely overlooked. Though their colleagues in Italy had used plaster casts since at least the end of the 15th century, Dutch painters more consistently chose to represent themselves accompanied by casts. Through these images, Dutch painters explored relationships with one another and with the Netherlandish sculptors whose works they reproduced. As their social status improved, painters were caught in a bind. How could they recommend their profession and stoke their patrons' curiosity about it without revealing its challenges? To produce paintings of the studio and its contents was to control the narrative of what occurred there. In the Netherlands, the image of the artist at work had its most significant precedence in the visual tradition of St. Luke drawing the Virgin. These pictures, first and foremost devotional icons, related painters to their patron saint and allowed them to showcase their essential instruments, which thus entered easel paintings before the contemporary painter himself. The emergence of the genre of the artist studio in the Dutch Republic coincided with a proliferation of images that featured the tools and physical activity involved in a variety of occupations. According to Alison Kettering, quote, Dutch artists produced and Dutch buyers purchased paintings of men engaged in all sorts of skilled labor, unquote, more than in any other European society at the time. Painters had a renewed imperative to differentiate themselves from professionals with similar attributes and work sites. Plaster casts were among the most distinctive objects painters regularly used and became a valuable choice for pictorial studios, where they are more numerous than in scenes of bookish scholars or alchemists. Sculptors also interacted with plaster casts, especially those that actually made casts in their workshops. The possessions of the sculptor Cornelis van den Blok, sold in Amsterdam in 1629, included a plaster cupid and dozens of pieces of pleisterwerk, or plaster pieces. Albert Vinkenbrink, who primarily sculpted in palm wood, owned 22 boxes of plasterwork at the time of his death in 1665. In the Amsterdam workshop of Bartholomeus Eggers, The room called the shop contained casts of ancient subjects, such as an Palace van Plaster, presumably for sale, and a cabinet in which Eggers kept unfired plaster. 29 plaster and clay heads were in the casting room, while in the best room of the house, Eggers kept a series of Roman emperors and 3 sculptures on the fireplace mantelpiece, all made of plaster. Though he was best known for his marble busts, he also made his own plaster casts as intermediary steps and to sell in his shop, and selected others to decorate his home. These inventories provide at least a partial picture of the circulation of plaster sculpture in the Dutch Republic, while depictions of them grant further insight into their multiple meanings and functions. Dutch artists lived with plaster casts perhaps more than anyone else in the prosperous Republic, and they pictorialized them. The casts in Gerrit Douw's Artist in his Studio evoke classical literature, disciplined learning, and the modern taste for copies of famous sculpture. Behind the painter looms a large plaster Hercules and Cacus, based not on the era's most famous example, Bandinelli's 1534 marble in Florence, but on one that captures the struggle between the adversaries. It closely resembles this bronze statuette based on a series of Hercules' 12 labors by the Flemish sculptor Jan Bologna. Douw's use of this cast alongside the solitary painter reflects the impression made by the theorist Carl van Munder's interpretation of the story. Van Munder saw Hercules' defeat of the fire-breathing giant as a metaphor for virtue's victory over vice and envy. As Ivan Gaskell has argued, since envy was considered a primary enemy of art, Hercules' triumph had special significance for Douw, who had already achieved great success. The celebration of Hercules as a paragon of virtue augmented his allure as a character from the ancient world. Moreover, identifying the minor episode of Hercules' confrontation with Cacus, not represented as frequently as others, required deep knowledge of classical literature. The casts appear in Douw's paintings as a manifestation of the painter's social and professional aspirations. And plaster casts, including the female head in the Artist in the Studio, appear regularly in Douw's oeuvre. One in particular served him time and again, the cast of a 1626 marble relief by the Flemish sculptor Francois Duquesnoy. Copies of Duquesnoy's work proliferated in the 17th century. For example, Frits Holten has analyzed the inventory of a family of sculptors in The Hague and convincingly proposed that their busy workshop produced, among others, plaster copies of Duquesnoy's Cupid with a Bow. It's likely that Douw could have purchased, or at the very least seen and drawn, a cast of this Duquesnoy relief. As many have noted, Douw's choice of the Duquesnoy relief points to his participation in the theoretical debate on Paragone, the legendary competition between painting and sculpture. Given that the source for the relief was a plaster cast, Douw's depiction of it are doubly performative. To boast that paint can completely imitate stone, he must use it to transform plaster into marble. Through the repetition of this motif, Douw turned the citation of another artist's work into a personal trademark. He cultivated an association with the relief that his successors recognized. In Jacob Torenfleet's Allegory of Painting, a cast of the Children with a Goat sits beside a personification of the art of painting. Douw, Torenfleet's uncle-in-law, had died in 1675, around the time Torenfleet completed the painting. In it, the cast pays homage to Douw and his legacy by explicitly linking Duquesnoy's relief to the nobility of painting. Now, generalizations made about plaster casts in Dutch paintings can give the impression that ancient sculpture was par excellence the reference material. And to be sure, Painter's knowledge of ancient statues is readily felt. In his 1679 self-portrait, Michiel van Musser presents himself in an interior that is both refined home and workspace, in a visual rhyme with a cast of the Borghese gladiator. The sweep of the gladiator's body echoes van Musser's own elegant bend, while the thin sword finds a counterpart in the mahlstick between his fingers. Van Musser painted the same cast seen from behind on another occasion, which suggests he may have procured it at some point. In the self-portrait, the Borghese gladiator is both a collector's item and a model from which to draw an idealized body sanctioned by the ancients. But the ancient prototype was by no means the norm. The plaster casts Douw and his contemporaries chose to paint were often based on the creations of Netherlandish sculptors, showing a favor for modern sculpture that propagated the fame of fellow Netherlanders. Their warm reception of 16th century Netherlandish sculptors is an inadvertent corrective to Van Mander's focus only on the lives of painters in his Lives of Artists, excluding such renowned sculptors as John Bologna. One of the most frequently reproduced casts in 17th century Dutch paintings is the anatomically instructive Ekmerché by Willem van te Trode of Delft, modeled and cast in bronze while he was working in Florence. Around 1635, Cornelis Saftleven included a plaster cast of the statuette in a musical scene set in the corner of a painter's studio. A later picture of a young scholar reading by lamplight also puts the plaster Ekmerché prominently on view. The casts in these pictures indicate an abiding enthusiasm among Dutch painters for Netherlandish sculpture, available through plaster copies even when the originals resided elsewhere on the continent. Frans van Mieris, Douw's most successful pupil, also recognized plaster casts as essential components of the painter's work. And this is most fully articulated in his diminutive pictura. In the 17th century, representations of this allegorical figure adhered to the conventions set by Cesare Ripa's Iconologia from 1593. In the frontispiece to the book's Dutch edition, Pictura appears with a cloth over her mouth, a mask on a necklace, and brushes in both hands. Van Mieris not only omitted the figure's mouth covering, affording her a more naturalistic aspect, he also determined that Pictura required another attribute. She holds a plaster statuette of a muscular bearded man holding a shield, either a Mars or a Hercules. Scholten has identified it as a design by artist Collinus from his Amsterdam period. That a Mars or Hercules by Collinus would have been replicated in plaster is conceivable given the documented circulation of plaster casts of Collinus' sculpture. The marble bust of the politician Johan de Witt, commissioned from Collinus in 1665, entered the collections of de Witt's elite supporters in the form of plaster casts, while Collinus' busts of Amsterdam mayors were a popular choice for reproduction in plaster. Thus, the plaster statuette in Van Mieris' Pictura seems to continue Dutch painters' preference for centering Netherlandish sculpture. If Pictura's mask is a symbol of imitation and promises that painting can deceive the eye, the plaster statuette, like the Duquesnoy relief in Douw's work, solicits comparison with sculpture as the principal way to evaluate a painted illusion. But Van Mieris' choice to give Pictura a plaster cast is also anchored in a literal exploration of the painter's supplies. The brushes in Pictura's hand are highly individualized, rooted in firsthand experience. The palette, too, is specific, with 7 distinct colors evenly laid out along one edge. In his self-portrait of 1667, Van Mieris repeated this arrangement of colors from light to dark, which reflects both a personal preference and a custom among later 17th century painters. Van Mieris paints the plaster statuette, too, as if closely observed, careful to render visible the seams across the figure's right forearm and wrist that recalls that it was cast in multiple molds. Van Mieris' sons also incorporated plaster casts into their real and painted studios. Jan van Mieris' portrait of a smoking painter shows an artist taking a pause from his work to smoke a pipe, but the casts in the picture proclaim that his diligence is not to be questioned. Behind him stands a plaster Apollo after a sinuous bronze by Duquesnoy, and beside it the plaster head of Cupid. The Apollo and Cupid had been published in 1670 in Jan de Bissop's Compendium of Sculpture, which likely precipitated the creation of plaster versions, including enlargements such as this one. At the edge of his table, a drawing of a muscular torso further confirms the painter's commitment to mastering the contours of the body in chalk and charcoal before painting them. Frans van Mieris' impact is proudly memorialized by his grandson in the 3 generations. Frans van Mieris the Younger painted his own father and incorporated his namesake through a framed drawing of Van Mieris the Elder, set alongside an engraved version of the portrait in Arnold Houbraken's 1718 volume on the lives of famous artists. The 3 painters are presented as a unit whose bonds depend not only on their familial identity, but also on the materials and techniques they share. As the author of this picture, Frans holds the brushes and palette, which, dotted with paint judiciously distributed to handle with individual brushes, is characteristic of the meticulous method advocated by his grandfather, the eldest Van Mieris. Willem has a sheet of paper in his lap, unrolled just enough to reveal a drawing in progress. And between father and son lie sources of inspiration, including the ultimate exemplar, Frans van Mieris. Willem probably drew from casts while training with his father and sustained an interest in them throughout his life. In 1694, he, along with Jacob Torenvliet and Karel de Moor, founded a drawing academy in Leiden, for which they amassed a collection of plaster casts of ancient statues and fragments. Shortly thereafter, Willem made highly finished drawings of classicizing sculptures by the contemporary Flemish sculptor Francis van Bosshout. Some of Willem's most important patrons owned van Bosshout's work, including casts of it. Peter and Allard de la Cour alone had 12 plaster casts after van Bosshout originals, which Willem may have used for his drawings. Willem apparently also bought casts for himself. The German art lover Zacharias Conrad von Uffenbach, who visited Willem in 1711, noted in his travel book that the Leiden master must have had many in his private possession. These were the ones most likely to end up with his son, Van Mieris the Younger, and in fact, the cast in the background of the three generations suggests as much. As Junko Ono has observed, one of the plaster casts on the shelf had served Willem as the model for the crouching dog in several genre pictures. Below it, a reduction of the famous Belvedere torso signals the family's knowledge of canonical works of antiquity. Fragments and casts of extremities of the sort that Willem drew from and used in the Leiden Academy also hang on the wall. A cast of a head in profile and a left arm that humorously repeats the pointing finger of Van Mieris the Younger. But it is the plaster cast on the shelf, partially hidden behind the green curtain, that most amplifies the working process of the three painters. This one too recalls, Willem's past attention to plaster casts. A standing female nude, this cast resembles the Venus and Cupid after Van Bosshout that Willem composed in black chalk, which Ono has argued served as inspiration for his history paintings. In the triple portrait, the plaster cast is the model for the painting set on the easel, which depicts a Cupid next to a Venus in a similar stance. Her left leg is bent and a blue cloth decorously wraps around her upper thigh. The plaster cast also relates to the drawing in Willem's lap. The sheet shows the initial renderings of the head and hand of Venus and thereby completes the truncated image of the plaster cast, whose head is obscured by the curtain. Plaster cast, drawing, and painting are inextricably related variations on the same subject. This relationship across the painting offers subtle insights into the steps taken by each painter to achieve a carefully planned classical subject. The three generations enlist the studio and the plaster cast therein to communicate the admiration the youngest Van Mieris felt for his father and grandfather and to express their affinity with one another. The triple portrait urges the viewer to see the studio and its contents as physical reminders of the interactions between the three painters, determined as much by artistic inclination as by blood. Obrigada. Thank you for listening.